Jack stood alone in the cold autumn air, the weight of his years pressing down on him as heavily as the grief he carried. It had been 2 years since his son Tom had died in a car accident. Since that day, Jack's visits to the grave had become a ritual, his only way of feeling close to the son who had been his pride, but also his greatest disappointment. The cemetery was quiet, as it always was early in the morning. Jack preferred it that way. He wasn't ready to talk to anyone about Tom, not the press, not his business partners, and certainly not his so-called friends. As a man of wealth and power, Jack had always controlled his surroundings, but no amount of money or influence could bring Tom back. Today, though, something was different. As Jack approached Tom's grave, he saw a figure kneeling by the headstone. A young man, no older than 20, with tousled dark hair and a jacket too thin for the chilly weather. His head was bowed in prayer, hands clasped tightly, as if clinging to something Jack couldn't see. Jack felt a sudden, unfamiliar irritation rise in him. This was his moment, his time to grieve in private. Who was this boy, and why was he here, at Tom's grave? Clearing his throat, Jack made his presence known. The boy looked up, startled, his pale blue eyes wide with something between fear and sadness. He scrambled to his feet, brushing dirt from his jeans. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to. I was just—" The boy stammered, taking a step back, clearly nervous. Jack's gaze hardened. "What are you doing here? Do you even know who this grave belongs to?" The boy hesitated, his eyes flicking down to the headstone before meeting Jack's again. "Yes, sir, I know exactly who it belongs to. Tom was—" He stopped himself, as if unsure how much to say. Jack's anger gave way to confusion. There was something familiar about the boy, something he couldn't quite place. But before he could press further, the boy turned and walked away, disappearing down the cemetery path, leaving Jack alone once again with his questions. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that lingered after the boy's sudden departure. As the days passed, the encounter gnawed at him. Who was that young man? And why did he seem so familiar with Tom's grave? The questions wouldn't leave Jack alone, even in the quiet of his mansion. The house, once filled with life, now felt like a museum of the past, each room a reminder of Tom's absence. Jack had built an empire, amassed more wealth than most could imagine, but his greatest failure, losing Tom, overshadowed it all. Driven by a restless need for answers, Jack started making calls. He spoke to old friends of Tom's, people from the business world, and even private investigators he had worked with before. It wasn't long before he found a lead. The boy's name was Benny, and he had a connection to Tom that Jack never knew about. Benny's mother, Sarah, had been a young woman from the wrong side of town. She and Tom had been involved years ago, a relationship that Jack had dismissed at the time as a fleeting infatuation. But what Jack didn't know was that Sarah had been left behind with more than just memories. She had been left behind with a son, Tom's son. Jack's world spun as he processed the Revy. Benny wasn't just some stranger praying at the grave, he was Tom's son, his grandson. The enormity of the truth hit Jack harder than he expected. He had always believed that his wealth could solve any problem, that his influence could control any situation. But this was something no amount of money could fix. He had a grandson, living in poverty, and he had never known. Jack's first reaction was disbelief. How could Tom have hidden something like this from him? And why hadn't Sarah ever seen? The questions were endless, but the answers were all out of reach. There was only one thing Jack knew for sure. He had to meet Benny again. And this time, there would be no walking away. Jack wasted no time. His resources, which had always been at his fingertips, were now focused on a single goal: locating Benny and learning more about the life his grandson had been forced to live without him. He called his private investigator again, demanding more details, more information on Benny's whereabouts. The investigator, well practiced in discretion, gave Jack a new lead. Benny lived in a modest part of town with his mother, Sarah. The next afternoon, Jack found himself driving through a neighborhood he hadn't been to in decades. The streets were lined with small houses, each one a far cry from the opulence he was accustomed to. The air felt heavy with the realities of a life Jack had never experienced firsthand. He pulled up in front of a weathered single-story house, paint peeling from the siding, and a broken fence surrounding a small yard. His chest tightened as he realized how starkly this contrasted with the life he had provided for Tom. Stepping out of his car, Jack approached the house, rehearsing what he would say. Before he could knock, the door opened and there stood Sarah, a woman he barely recognized. The years had aged her, but the look in her eyes was unmistakable, cautious, defensive, as though she knew why Jack was there. "Sarah," Jack began, his voice steady but unsure of how to continue. "I'm here to talk about Benny." Her expression tightened. She stepped out onto the porch, closing the door behind her to shield the interior of the house from Jack's view. "I don't think there's anything to talk about," she replied coldly. "You've had your life, Jack. Benny and I have had ours." Her words stung more than Jack had anticipated. He had expected hostility, perhaps even anger, but not the finality in her voice. "I didn't know," Jack said after a long pause. "About Benny, about what Tom—" Sarah cut him off. "You didn't know because you didn't want to know. Tom was never going to be the man you wanted him to be, and when he realized that, he left." She folded her arms across her chest, standing firm in her resolve. "We didn't need you then, and we don't need you now." Jack clenched his fists, the guilt gnawing at him. "I'm not here to make excuses," he said softly. "I know I've made mistakes. I wasn't the father Tom needed, and I didn't give him the chance to tell me about Benny. But I'm here now. I want to know my grandson. I want to help." Sarah's gaze softened, just slightly, but her stance didn't waver. "Benny doesn't need your help, Jack. He's lived his whole life without you, without your money, without your influence. He's a good boy, and I won't leave." Jack took a deep breath, swallowing the knot in his throat. "I'm not here to hurt him, I just want to be part of his life, if he'll let me." Sarah didn't respond immediately, her eyes studying Jack as if trying to gauge the sincerity of his words. "I'll talk to him," she said finally, "but don't expect him to welcome you with open arms." That evening, Jack waited in the silence of his grand estate, the contrast between his world and Benny's weighing heavily on his mind. For the first time in his life, Jack felt powerless. Money couldn't buy what he needed now. He couldn't erase the years of absence, the lost moments that had shaped Benny's life without him. The next day, Jack received a call. It was Sarah. "Benny agreed to meet you," she said curtly, "but on his terms. He'll come to your office tomorrow at noon." Jack thanked her, his voice betraying the mix of relief and anxiety he felt. Benny wanted to meet him. It was a small victory, but Jack knew that this was only the beginning of a much larger journey. When noon arrived, Jack sat in his office, the spacious room suddenly feeling too big, too empty. The empire he had built over the years felt meaningless now that he was faced with the task of building something far more fragile, a relationship with his grandson. The door opened and Benny walked in, his posture tense, his eyes wary. Jack stood, extending a hand, but Benny hesitated, his gaze fixed. "You don't have to do that," Benny muttered, stepping farther into the room but keeping his distance. Jack dropped his hand, nodding slightly. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I wasn't sure if you would." Benny shrugged, still not looking directly at Jack. "I didn't come because I wanted to," he said bluntly. "I came because Mom asked me to." Jack's heart sank. He had hoped for a different response, but he knew this wasn't going to be easy. "I understand," Jack said, trying to keep his tone but I'm glad you're here. I know you don't know me and you probably don't want to, but I'd like to get to know you, Benny. I'd like to be part of your life, if that's something you'd want." Benny finally looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and confusion. "Why now?" he demanded. "Why do you care now after all this time?" Jack felt the weight of Benny's words like a punch to the gut. How could he explain his absence, his ignorance, without sounding like a man full of excuses? "I didn't know," Jack began, his voice faltering. I didn't know you existed. If you had, what? Benny interrupted, his voice rising. You would have swooped in and taken me out of that life? You would have made everything better with your money? Jack opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Benny's words stung because they were true. That had been Jack's initial thought, hadn't it? That he could fix everything with his wealth. No, Jack said finally, his voice quiet, but I can't fix the past. I can't change what's already happened. But I can be here now. I can try to make things right from this point forward, if you'll let me. Benny stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without another word, he turned and left the office, the door clicking softly behind him. Jack stood there in the empty room, the silence pressing in once more. He hadn't expected Benny to accept him right away, but the rejection still cut deep. This was going to ta, but for the first time in years, Jack was willing to wait. The following days were restless for Jack. His mind was consumed by questions about the mysterious boy at Tom's grave. Who was Benny? How did he know Tom? And why had he seemed so secretive? Back at his mansion, Jack paced the long corridors, the echoes of his footsteps a constant reminder of the emptiness that filled his once lively home. The vast estate, built with the spoils of his business empire, felt more like a mausoleum now, a testament to the life he had constructed but could no longer enjoy. Without Tom, the house felt hollow, like a grand stage with no actors to bring it to life. The encounter with Benny had stirred something in Jack that he hadn't felt in years, a need to know. He had spent so long mourning Tom, regretting their strained relationship, that he hadn't thought to dig deeper into his son's life. Now that lack of knowledge felt like a chasm he needed to bridge. Driven by a newfound sense of purpose, Jack began his search. He contacted old friends of Tom's, hired private investigators, and even reached out to some of the people Tom had worked with during his short stint in Jack's company. It wasn't long before the pieces of the puzzle started falling into place. Benny wasn't just a stranger. He was Tom's son. Jack stared at the papers spread across his desk, the realization sinking in lie. The investigators had traced Benny back to a young woman named Sarah, someone Tom had been involved with years ago. Jack vaguely remembered her, a girl from a poor neighborhood that Tom had dated briefly. At the time, Jack had brushed off the relationship, assuming it was just a phase his son would outgrow. After all, Tom had a bright future ahead of him, a future Jack had meticulously planned. But Sarah had been more than just a passing fling. She had been left behind, pregnant and abandoned when Tom had moved on with his life. Jack felt a pang of guilt he hadn't expected. He had always pushed Tom to aim higher, to leave behind anything that might hold him back. He had never imagined that this would be the result. A grandson he never knew existed, living in poverty while Jack sat in a mansion, oblivious to their struggles. Jack picked up one of the photographs the investigators had found. It was a picture of Benny and Sarah, taken outside a small rundown house on the outskirts of town. Benny looked younger, but those same pale blue eyes stared back at Jack from the photograph, the same eyes that had haunted him at the grave. How had things gotten to this point? How had Tom kept this a secret? And why hadn't Sarah ever come forward? Jack's mind raced with 100 different questions, each more painful than the last. But one thing was clear. He couldn't ignore this any longer. The next morning, Jack found himself back at the cemetery, standing at Tom's grave. But this time his mind wasn't on his son's death. It was on his grandson. He needed to find Benny again. He needed to make this right. As Jack left the cemetery, determination set in. He didn't know what Benny's life had been like, but he was certain of one thing. It was time for him to step in. Tom may have left a mess behind, but Jack wasn't going to let his grandson slip through the cracks. Not now. Not after. The next weekend, Jack found himself standing outside the same small house where he had first confronted Sarah. But this time, he wasn't here to argue or demand answers. He was here with a different plan. The autumn air was crisp, the leaves turning a vibrant orange and red as they rustled in the breeze. Jack had always been too busy to notice the beauty of the seasons, but now, as he stood in a place so far from his world, He felt grounded in a way he hadn't felt in years. He carried with him something that had taken a lot of thought: a modest box of tools. Jack knew Benny worked odd jobs around town, fixing things, doing whatever he could to support his mother. It wasn't much, but Jack hoped this gesture would show that he wasn't here to flash his wealth or offer solutions that didn't fit Benny's reality. Taking a deep breath, Jack walked up to the door and knocked. This time, when Sarah opened it, her expression was less guarded, though she still looked wary. "W?" she asked, eyeing the box in Jack's hands. "I thought I could help," Jack said simply. "I know Benny works hard to keep things running here. I brought some tools, thought we could fix a few things around the house. Maybe spend some time together." Sarah stared at him for a moment, clearly caught off guard. She glanced at the tools, then back at Jack. Finally, she stepped aside, gesturing for him to come in. Benny appeared from the back of the house, his expression unreadable as he saw Jack standing there, holding the tools. Jack could feel the tension in the room. He wasn't sure if this was the right approach, but it was all he could think of. "I don't need your money," Benny said flatly, crossing his arms over his chest. "I'm not offering money," Jack replied, his voice calm. "I'm offering my help." Benny frowned, clearly suspicious. "Why? What do you know about fixing anything?" Jack chuckled, a dry, self-deprecating sound. "Not much, to be honest, but I can learn. And I figured maybe we could work on something together." Benny didn't say anything for a long moment. He just stood there, his gaze flicking from the tools to Jack's face as though trying to figure out if this was some kind of trick. But then, slowly, he uncrossed his arms. "All right," Benny said finally. "We'll see what you've got." Jack nodded, a small sense of relief washing over him. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Together, they stepped outside, moving toward the shed that needed repairs. It was a small project, but for Jack, it felt monumental. As they worked side by side in silence, Jack could feel the weight of the past starting to lift, if only just a little. He wasn't trying to fix everything at once. He was simply trying to be present, trying to show Benny that he was here for more than just appearances. And for the first time in years, Jack felt like he was finally building something that mattered. The days following that first project at Sarah's house moved slowly, but for Jack, they were filled with more meaning than he had experienced in years. Every day brought a new challenge, not in business but in building a relationship with Benny. They continued working together on small repairs around the house, fixing a leaky faucet, repairing the back fence, even tackling some electrical work that neither of them had any real experience with. Each project was a tentative step toward something bigger. Jack could sense Benny's wariness softening, but he knew it would take time to fully gain his trust. Still, being there, side by side with his grandson, felt like progress. "I only thought about what I thought he should be." Benny was silent for a long moment, the tension between them palpable. Jack waited, knowing that this conversation wasn't one that could be rushed. "Tom wasn't like you," Benny finally said, his voice quiet but firm. "He wanted something different." Jack felt a pang of guilt twist in his chest. "I know," he admitted. "I didn't see it then, but I do now. I didn't understand him, and I never gave him the chance to show me who he really was." Benny finally looked up at Jack, his blue eyes, the same as Tom's, filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "He didn't hate you, you know. He was just scared to disappoint you." Jack's heart clenched. Of all the things he had feared, the idea that his son had lived in fear of disappointing him hurt the most. He had wanted to give Tom everything, but in the end, he had given him a burden too heavy to carry. "I'm sorry," Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was wrong, B, about you, about everything." Benny didn't say anything, but the hard edge in his expression softened just a little. He nodded, and though it wasn't forgiveness, it was a step toward it. As the weeks turned into months, Jack's relationship with Benny continued to grow. They spent more time together, not just working on the truck or around the house, but talking, really talking. Benny opened up more about his life, his dreams, and the struggles he and Sarah had faced over the years. Jack listened, learning more about his grandson than he ever could have imagined. One afternoon, while they were sitting on the porch, Benny brought up something that had been weighing on his mind. "I've been thinking about school again." Jack turned to him, intrigued. "Yeah? What are you thinking?" Benny shrugged, looking a little uncertain. "I don't know. I've always liked working with my hands, but I think I might want to learn more about cars. Maybe get a degree in automotive engineering or something like that." Jack's face lit up. "That's a great idea, Benny. You've got a real talent for this. If that's something you want to pursue, I'll support you in any way I can." Benny looked at Jack, a hint of skepticism in his eyes. "I don't need your money, Jack." Jack raised his hands in mock surrender. I know. I'm not offering money, Joe. Whatever you need, whether it's advice, resources, or just someone to talk things through with, I'm here." Benny nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I appreciate that." Jack leaned back, a sense of satisfaction settling over him. This was what he had wanted all along, not to throw money at problems, but to be there for Benny in a meaningful way. He felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years, not since Tom had been alive. By the time Benny's first day of classes arrived, the tension that had once defined his relationship with Jack was a distant memory. Jack stood on the porch of Sarah's house, watching as Benny loaded the last of his things into an old car they had fixed up together. It wasn't much, but it would get him to and from school, a small victory they had both earned. "You all set?" Jack asked, his voice filled with both pride and a hint of sadness. Benny nodded, glancing up at Jack with a smile. "Yeah." Jack felt a pang of emotion as he looked at Benny. This was the moment he had been working toward, the moment he had feared he might never reach. His grandson was moving forward, chasing his dreams, building a life of his own. And Jack knew, without a doubt, that Tom would have been proud of the man Benny had become. "I'll see you on the weekends, right?" Jack asked, his tone light. Benny chuckled. "Yeah, I'll be around. Besides, I'll probably need some help with all this school stuff." Jack smiled, his heart full. "I'll be here whenever you need me." As Benny got into the car and pulled out of the driveway, Jack watched him go with a deep sense of contentment. This was the legacy he wanted to leave, not the wealth or the empire he had built, but the relationships he had salvaged, the love he had finally learned to give. As the car disappeared down the road, Jack stood on the porch, feeling the spring breeze against his face. The emptiness that had once haunted him after Tom's death was gone, replaced by the warmth of family, of second chances. He had spent so long trying to build an empire that he had nearly forgotten what truly mattered. But now, with Benny and Sarah in his life, Jack knew that he had found something far more valuable than money or power. He had found his family, and in that, he had finally found redemption. Thank you for joining me on this emotional journey of redemption, family, and second chance. If you enjoyed this story, click the card above to explore more heartwarming and impactful stories like this one. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. I love hearing your thoughts, so please drop a comment below. I read every single one and can't wait to hear what you think about Jack and Benny's journey.